Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our session on the neuroscience of storytelling. We have with us today Richard Fleming, who's owner of Sage Media and Sage Academy, and he combines art with neuroscience to make films that improve learning. So he's going to talk to us today about how we can best capitalize on that, some key distinctions that we need to know as we think about storytelling. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Richard.
Great. Thank you. Just going to get my thing here. Hope all of you are doing well. Got a lot to cover, so I'm just going to kind of jump right in. My filmmaking journey really began with the commercial sector. I was actually working on a bunch of different projects, from indie films to commercials, even worked on a Super Bowl spot. And while, just as a little bragging rights here, some of the clients I've been working with, I've got about 20 Fortune 500 companies under my portfolio, and I transitioned away from filmmaking to L&D, filmmaking for L&D specifically, because of some of the influences that movies had had on my life, and I felt that that wasn't just singular to me. So an example I'll give is, when I was 20, I saw this movie by a relatively prominent Russian filmmaker, and it changed my life. I'm not going to spoil the movie, but if you haven't seen it, I would highly recommend this picture. At the end of the film, I sat in the theater for 30 minutes, just wondering what I was going to do with my life. And I didn't realize that a film could become something far more than just entertainment, that it actually became philosophical. And it wasn't preachy or bombastic. It was really just something that I found changed my mindset. It made me look at the world in a different way. And I thought, well, is this just my own unique perspective? Or is this something that movies have the power to be able to do, that stories have the power to be able to do? So I went on this long journey to try to figure out, what are the neuroscience aspects? What's the science behind how these things work? I appreciate the mythic structure and how stories influence us in kind of this unspoken emotional way, but I wanted some of the evidence. I wanted to know what's really going on behind the scenes. So there's a lot of information in this field called neurocinematics, which is the spectrum that of neuroscience that I'm kind of involved in. And one of the things I appreciate about it is it uses fMRI and eye tract scanning and stuff to really determine how are people functioning. There's a lot of stuff that we know about media and its impact on the brain, and that's kind of what I do for Sage Media and Sage Academy. I take big learning initiatives, people that have a troublesome, complex learning objective, and they need to convey it to an audience that's not primed for learning. Maybe they're rushed, or they're overwhelmed, or they're not engaged, or they're not emotionally connected. And I create stories that help drive that small behavior change. So one of the things that I recommend in people using storytelling is it has a twofold benefit. It increases retention and it increases emotional investment. So you've probably seen this stat a number of times. Learners are 22 times more likely to remember a fact when it's wrapped in a story. Part of the reason that is because our brains are hardwired for play. We, like many animals in the animal kingdom, use play to improve our skills. So we see this with cats beating the crap out of paper bags and strings and stuff, and dogs roughhousing, or even dolphins that play with air streams so they can create these beautiful little bubbles. There's no real reason for them to do that. They just enjoy it, and it teaches them things about the world. Our play as human beings is in ideation as children, pretend play as children. As adults, it's sharing stories. So there's a really huge benefit to using storytelling from a retention purpose. I want to mention too that part of the reason that on top of this idea that this is play, consider the inductive power of storytelling. So when we recap, deductive learning is really about presenting information and rules to somebody about the world and expecting them to recall them on the fly. Now, the issue with this is that if the situation or circumstance varies at all, you've got a different condition, and sometimes the learner falls apart. So I think of this as like in self-defense training when you see novices, they show them a move and like, oh, block this way, and then the person does a slight variation of the punch and the person completely collapses. So deductive learning is good for many things, but in the area where you need synthesis, where you need creativity, inductive learning is what you want. Inductive learning is where you basically guide the learner to observing the world and the rules, and then basically being able to formulate their own theories about it. So they're projecting. And if we think about this from Bloom's taxonomy, for example, the highest order of that peak is creativity or synthesis. I teach you a creative writing technique and you use it to write the cover letter of your resume. That's not how I showed you, but like you're using this and inventing this. Stories have a natural ability to create inductive learning because of the way that they're structured. So when you think of storytelling, or how I summarize it to people, it's nothing more really than a series of events or actions. But the mind naturally strings them together because that's what the brain does. When I mentioned that, we're really good at play and imagination, part of that play is making connections to things that are seemingly irrelevant or seemingly that don't follow. So if I tell you that a man walks in, he shoots his wife, and then he leaves holding a picture of another man, there's something that happens in your brain that causally links these three things together. Now, I didn't tell you that he did that. I just gave you the events. Our brains naturally tie this together. This is what we do at Sage Media. We engineer these events so that learners make the conclusions for themselves. They make these leaps themselves. That's where learning happens. So in the context of recall and retention, this anchors people so well. It anchors information so much more potently than if you just gave them a presentation of facts. The other reason that stories engage us and improve our recall is because of the way that they emotionally engage us. So when we think about, left and right brain, that's really not it's a misnomer. It's not how the brain works. We're far more integrated, and it's not just these like very distinct hemispheres of left brain is math and right brain is art. It's a lot more integrated. And so I think one thing that especially stakeholders in the C-suite kind of ignore is that emotions are its own form of language, it's its own form of thinking. You want to engage people emotionally, and I don't mean to make them cry or to make them like upset. Emotions are the unspoken. They don't have access to linguistics or language, and so they still are their own communication. And this confuses people, but I just want to put it out there that like, do not think of emotions as like instincts or reactions. Think of them as making unseen connections in that in between the lines of those events, right? I had the event arrow. It's in between. It's linking those things. And emotions are what help anchor memory far more than anything else. So I want to keep going and talk about a campaign that I found really compelling, because the second question to me isn't just about like, okay, great. So I know that stories are great for learning and for recall and memory and all that stuff, but what about the doing, right? As learning designers, we're always asking, what do I want my learner to know? And what do I want my learner to do? So we got the knowing part pretty down. The do part is interesting. And if you're going to engage a change in behavior or a change in habit, you have to engage somebody's emotional investment. And the best way to do that is through a story. So there is an epidemic of AIDS and HIV in Tanzania. And part of the reason that they were having this issue, and it was weighted more towards women over men, so like astronomically more, something like 6 to 10% or 10 times more women were having this HIV outbreak. And part of the reason is because in Tanzania, there was this unspoken sugar daddy culture. So old men would pay for school, textbooks, clothing, food, whatever. And in exchange, they would expect, some kind of sexual favor from the women they were courting. The age difference was really extreme, and so their status was really at polar ends. And so the sugar daddies would often have influence over what the women did, particularly, using condoms or not. So like this was a huge issue. Now, if you think about a campaign that you're trying to release in your organization, one thing you might think is, well, why not just talk about the importance of condoms, right? Like spread awareness about how to use condoms, or none of that though solves the problem, because the behavior doesn't change. We know that this doesn't work. Like spreading awareness doesn't work. you need to change the actual behavior. You need to engage some kind of action. So what they did, this organization created this campaign around this character named Fataki. Fataki means fireworks or explosion. It has the connotation of being like, get away from this person, they're dangerous. And they made this character, this sugar daddy character, kind of a loser. Like, he wouldn't order, he'd order water because he didn't want to spend any more money than he had to. He was really cheap and he was kind of doofy. And they made this a phenomenon. Like, people they would refer to it. In fact, one popular actor was caught with a young girl at a hotel, and on the headline, they referred to him as a Fataki. So everyone started to be aware of this. It was like an 85% increase in people being aware of the word Fataki. And in creating this kind of humiliating character, it did two things. It enabled the agency of the women to say, I'm not going to be pressured by a Fataki. I'm not going to be pressured by somebody I don't respect. I'm going to push back. And it also kind of made the men a little bit more inhibited and resistant to doing things that would eventually humiliate them. So this had a huge impact, and I wouldn't think that character design would have this kind of impact. But if you think about it, this is very similar to meme culture, and we see on the internet now people sharing these little stories, and they don't just share these individual stories as isolated incidences. They all add to each other. Now, the question is, like, we've seen this, and this is great for the internet and for my Facebook feed and for me having a laugh. But what is the impact of this from the perspective of learning and development? So when we think about actions that will inspire change, this is from Daniel Pink's Drive. These are the things that you want to do to really inspire some kind of change. So lead with questions and not answers, engage in dialogue and debate, not coercion, right? You're not telling them what to do. It's inductive versus deductive. Conduct autopsies without blame. So be able to go back and actually like do a deep dive, a post-mortem analysis of what happened. And then build in red flag mechanisms, which is to say that give people an opportunity to speak up about what's going on. Again, without blame and without them feeling that they're going to there's some kind of retribution. This is perfect for storytelling, right? So if you create a really good story, it engages people in conversation. One of these training films I did recently was for a food safety company. They wanted to appeal to the C-suite. So the opening of this scene is a woman running through a suburban neighborhood, and she hears her daughter calling to her. And she's like, doesn't know where she is, and she's looking for her, and she ends up running and ends up in a graveyard. She's running through all of these headstones, and she gets in front of one of them, and she hears the muffled voice of her daughter being like, "I'm in here, please help me." And the mom's confused, like, "What? How did you get in there? Like, you're in the ground?" She's like, "Yes, like, please, I can't breathe. Like, get me out of here." She gets on the ground and she starts digging. She can't get the earth to move, and she looks around for help, and she sees these 4 black figures that are standing with umbrellas. You don't see their faces. They're completely dark. And she's screaming at them, like, "Please help my daughter." And they don't do anything. And she's like screaming for them to help, and then gets back down, starts digging, and becomes fatigued, collapses. Sits up, composes herself, looks right into the lens and says, "Well, this is the part where I usually wake up." And we snap into this like therapy room, and she's recounting the situation of her losing her daughter to a food-related illness. This, I'm amazed that I got this approved, but it works because people are like, "What am I watching? I don't understand what's happening. I have all these questions. I'm trying to figure these things out." And it engages them in a thought process where they are fully invested. And so this is why I think where we really need to move is to make this happen for L&D and for corporate learning. Because I don't understand why corporate training is so bad. I want to ask you really quickly, if you can put in some of the chat, why do you think that training, what are some of the obstacles that trainers face that prevent them from making compelling stories? What's problematic to you? What are you struggling with? Just pop some stuff into the chat. What's a difficulty? What's a barrier? Why is corporate training so corporate-y? Why does it look like this? Avoidance of fun. That's great. Why can't we have fun? This is 2021. one of my core values is love of learning. And I'm like, why is learning still like this? Like, it's been how many years, how many decades have gone by? We have all these great advancements and it still looks like this. Fun is great. Having play engages people. Yeah, spoon-fed of learning, not effortful. And so part of the thing is really getting people to speak to them, to make their own effort. What's in it for your learner? That's a great way to approach this. Lack of focus or engagement and time. Awesome. So the things I'm going to show you or talk about, Veronica, won't actually affect your time. It makes it easier for you to do this process. And Ranjani as well, like the lack of focus, this is the next best thing. We're going to attack both of these right now. So the first thing I'll mention is like, poor character design is a really obvious one that just like, they're not believable. And I don't want to get too far into that. I just want to make the mention of like, when you have a compelling character, like the Fataki character, it engages people because they're surprised. They actually remember characters more when they subvert expectation. So when you're thinking of creating some kind of like, this is John, John's in HR, try to make John subversive, try to make John interesting. What's a vivid aspect of John that would make him more intriguing? Next thing I'll mention is, and I think this goes to the speaking to the avoidance of fun, is avoidance of conflict. I had a client once tell me like, we want something more dramatic. And so I build this crazy drama and I have this like fight between this manager and his employee. And they're like, well, we don't want them to be conflicted. Like, drama is conflict. Like, and I tell people all the time as a filmmaker that like, there's drama in my work, not in my life. And I think it's true because I don't want to live that, but this doesn't mean I need to avoid it. And when I'm making a story, I'm going to make it as absolutely difficult as possible. I'm going to run my character through hell because I want them to suffer, because watching them suffer teaches me something about the world. It teaches me something about myself. And the thing is, like, on that just the last part about with the play to reinforce that, the beautiful thing about these dramatic scenarios is I never need to experience them, but that's why they're addictive. They're addictive because I want to see scenarios in which I'm not going to ever have to, risk hurting myself, right? It's why dreams are so vivid, because it's your brain play acting out all of these things. It's like, what if I died? What if I lost a limb? Like stuff that you hope to God never happens, but you need to be able to like mentally go through that process because it teaches you things. It helps you become more prepared to confront the world. The last thing I'll mention, and this is the key thing, this is what happened, this is what my whole pitch is about, is the core premise. Core premise is the moral of a story, right? If you think about any kind of structure, right? You've got this ABCD of learning objectives, of building these. You've got a framework that you work with. The core premise is the framework for storytelling. So if you think about Aesop, right? He's got these really great little aphorisms, and then he tells you a story about it. And so he tells you the story, and then it's summarized by this little moral of the story. This is basically what storytellers miss and what L&D people miss all the time. So a lot of even professional storytellers don't go through this process. They just want to start writing. The lack of focus, and so I know you probably meant that in the context of the learner, but the reason that people lack focus is because the stories lack a linear core underlying message that drives the point forward. So if I want to tell you a story about, hey, you should never take candy from strangers, and I'm about to describe this one instance where I got my kidney stolen, but then I start telling like, oh yeah, but then this guy, like, he actually runs a bagel shop down the road, and the bagels are really good. If you go to like, get the sesame one, it's one of my favorites. You'd be like, dude, get back to the part about the kidney. Like that's the most important part. That's the relevant part of the story. That's what we're dealing with here, is that to build relevance, you have to understand what a core premise is. Understand what a core premise is. It's a very specific structure. And that structure would take me about an hour to teach you. I don't have time to go through it now, but I wanted to mention at least that I have a lecture available online. It's $25. This is my sales pitch, okay? Just don't shame me. But yeah, for $25, I basically get this little worksheet. And you go through this worksheet, and it teaches you how to convert a learning objective into a core premise. Now, the benefit of doing that is that you don't know, you have a learning objective. The learning objective has a singular message that if your learner knew it, they would do things differently. But you can't just outwardly even say that to them. If you said, I need you salespeople to be more vulnerable, well, they're like, yeah, okay, I got it. And then they don't do it. The way to engage them, the way to get them focused on that change is to engage them emotionally. The way to engage them emotionally is to tell them a story and the story has to be pertinent to the learning objective you're trying to convey. The way to do that is to take your learning objective and turn it into that moral premise, that moral of the story, that core premise. So if I know, like Aesop, that my core objective that I want my learner to walk away with is try pleasing all and end up pleasing none, I'm going to think of like, what's a story where that proved that, where that happened? Oh, the boy, the man, and the donkey. Like that, if you look that up, it's a great story because it entirely proves the point. Man wants to go take a donkey to the market, and he asks his son to come help him. As they're walking along, people are making fun of them for not sitting on the donkey, walking next to it, right? So they get on it, and then each time they get on it, somebody insults them for either the old man's like taking advantage of the boy's youth, or the boy is not respecting his elderly father. Finally, they decide to carry the donkey because then no one will complain. And they lash its legs around a pole, and as they're walking across a bridge, it freaks out, kicks itself free, falls in the water, and drowns. An old man who watches the entire thing chuckles, and he says, "Serves you right." That's the story that proves the core premise of try pleasing all and end up pleasing none. So I teach you how to do this process backwards by establishing what your learning objective is and then using that language to translate it to a core premise so that you can easily and readily find these stories. So that's my pitch. And if you have a core premise when you're building your stories, it becomes much easier for you to be able to convey the core point that you want your learners to achieve. This is how it's done. So any questions about this process? I don't want to go too much further, but I want to be able to answer any of your questions. Also, if you want to email me, you're welcome to. It's just richard@sage.media. I have the two businesses, the .media and .academy. So let's see if we got any questions here. We got a lot of stuff. God.
Let's see. So as we went through, a lot of people were really resonating with like getting to that premise piece and diving into that. They were making some ties across to the effective context model in Nick Shackleton-Jones's work on how people learn. And can you repeat the ABCD framework for the group?
Yes. So basically, and you can just Google this, like look up ABCD of learning objectives. It's a framework. I'm all about frameworks and about process. And so it's a framework for you to kind of help identify and build out a learning objective that's compelling. Because a lot of times, like I'll have clients that'll say, well, I want my learners to understand the importance of respect. It's like, well, that's not a measurable, clear piece. I'm a big fan, and my business partner's a big fan of the Kirkpatrick New World Model. He's actually certified in it because, and I get that people like will poo-poo Bloom's taxonomy and stuff because it's like not supported by science, but like it's effective. I mean, Alcoholics Anonymous is not supported by science, and yet it works. So I think that there are frameworks that are make your job easier. ABCD of learning objectives is one of those. So it's all about creating specificity, and the same thing with my process in building these stories. I have a framework that I use to create these repeatable programs that will help shift culture. What else was there?
I didn't see any other questions out there, but I did want to say that, as you were going through, there's a lot of great research, underpinning some of the stuff that you were saying. So really, that ability to affect behavior change because you are getting to that more memorable, bypassing judgment centers of the brain because they're not on, are you right or are you wrong? It's, what is this story? I'm curious, tell me more.
Yeah, curiosity is huge. And I think that we've kind of beat it out of ourselves as we grow older because it seems to not have a tangible ROI. And the biggest thing I'm about is like, there is a massive ROI. There are some that you could even prove in support. Like we built a calculator to estimate the financial risk of harassment related to, not related to payouts. So just like productivity issues, like having curiosity, having respect, having these things has tangible value. I think that the concern is that this process is avoided because it seems to cost more. It doesn't. I mean, you could do this stuff with puppets. You could do this stuff. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily recommend puppets, but you can do a lot of things with like cutouts and being creative. The issue I have, like I worked on Super Bowl stuff and I watched the Super Bowl ads, and a lot of them like missed a core premise. You know, the fundamentals of what I'm telling you right now, like this is stuff that multi-million-dollar agencies just sometimes don't do. They don't do it because it requires that you really ask questions and you stay curious and you stay excited about your work. And a lot of times they're not excited about the work. Like, I mean, that was my experience with ad agencies. But I think that you can do a lot of great work for nothing, for very cheap. I think the other aspect of it, of why people avoid it, is because it seems more complicated than it is. I think that we over-exacerbate and overemphasize like how only creative types tell stories. We all tell stories every single day. It's just about finding the right one that's going to fit for that time. I tell people to keep a story journal. Yes, recommended storytelling books. So for filmmaking, I mean, it's kind of hard because I've read like hundreds of them. I would say ones that stand out to me are The Anatomy of Story by John Truby is excellent. There's a guy who did a LinkedIn Learning course. It's got a couple problems, but he's a really good presenter and he really cares. There's Sell with a Story and Lead with a Story. Those are both decent. I'm really big into this one called Beyond the Screenplay, but it is a lot. Like you have to know Hegel's dialectic to really, and that's, I don't even want to get into that because it's like that there are fights about what Hegel's dialectic even means. But as a learning designer, you guys might appreciate it because it's fun. I mean, there's a lot of really interesting perspectives. And the last one would be John Howard Lawson's, any of his books, actually. John Howard Lawson had amazing stuff.
Well, great. So I put a couple links in there to John Truby's book, and then it was John Howard. What was his last name?
John Howard Lawson.
Lawson. Okay.
Yeah, he wrote around the time when like Elia Kazan was making movies and stuff. I think it was called like Film and the Art of Dramatic Writing or something like that, and the creative process. Yeah, Film, the Creative Process.
Oh,
it actually has like, he links philosophy evolution to storytelling, basically being like Ibsen wouldn't exist without Kant, and Samuel Beckett wouldn't exist without, you know, Derrida or something. Like he's got some really interesting perspectives. I don't think he mentioned Derrida, but okay.
Well, thank you very much, Richard, for joining us today. Again, it's sage.media or sage.academy if you want to go check that out. And thank you very much, Richard, for joining us today.
You're welcome. I'll put my email up real again.
Thank you, everybody. And if you have additional questions or that type of stuff, we will have the lounge set up, and you can always join out there and have conversations about what you're doing from a storytelling perspective.
Yeah, so we should chat because I want to go out there and hang out, and I'll be around for a little bit, answer questions.
Great. Thanks, Richard. Thanks, everyone.